Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our Business Insights Room. Every Thursday, Tim Sullivan and I, Maya Matsuoka, lead a discussion looking for insights, developments, and new opportunities for the business in Japan. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions. So if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the discussions on Japanese politics, business insights, and Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Our guest today is Micheal Mckay, a Canadian based in Cambodia. I met Micheal via a business course at the school, which we're both attending at the moment. Micheal is the co-founder of BB and Bongo, an enterprise which produces educational toys. BB and Bongo strives to employ women in rural communities in Cambodia and provide a source of income for them while allowing them to go about their everyday routines and family responsibilities. Micheal believes that it is possible to do good for the world and make profit, two things that many social innovation enterprises struggle to reconcile. Micheal, tell us about you and how you ended up in Cambodia and how you came up with the idea of the business then.
Sure. Thanks, Maya. Thanks for that introduction. I'm just going to apologize to everyone. It is early here, so there's a dog that lives on my property. He gets very excited anytime somebody walks by. So if there's a dog barking in the background, I apologize, and I hope it's not too distracting.
No,
Um,
fine.
yeah, thanks, Maya, for having me on. So because you led with the headline, I guess I'll talk a little bit maybe about how I got to that and then go into the business. So my background is actually originally in advertising and marketing. So I'm Canadian, and I worked in commercial advertising agencies for about 7 years in Canada, and then I thought I could do it better, and I opened my own agency for about 3.5 years. I was really driven by the idea of people doing passionate work. I saw a lot of creative people around me doing passion projects on the side outside of their day job, and so my original idea at that time for my own agency was to create a place that people loved to work. And that was my original sort of kokorozashi. And but I was young and I didn't know how to grow a business. I knew how to make money, but I didn't know how to really grow, and became very stressful and very overwhelming. And an opportunity came up to come to Cambodia to work for a social innovation lab. And what was interesting about that is that when you're in the commercial advertising space, all the fun work is not-for-profit stuff. It doesn't pay well, but it's always really fun. You get to be really creative. So coming and doing work in a social innovation lab, which was basically using my creative powers for good, was a interesting opportunity and sort of just what I needed at that time in my life. And so I came to Cambodia. I'd never been to Asia before. I'd never lived abroad before, so it was a bit of a jump into something new. But it was very exciting work, and a really great team, and we got to do a lot of behavior change interventions, human-centered design things, and we got to work with a lot of INGOs and NGOs. So in a lot of that international development space, we did some big projects with like USAID, World Bank, things like that. And I'd never been exposed to the international development space before. So on one hand, they're doing really good things for the world, but one of the things that I realized was it's not always as effective as it could be. There's a lot of really, really great people in that space with a lot of really good intentions, but not a lot of accountability sometimes to projects. We had a number of projects at different times that would start and then funding would run out, or they weren't sure if there was going to be another phase two. So unlike business where you have that sort of accountability of profit, a lot of these NGOs don't have that same sort of accountability. So if the funding runs out, then the project is over, and then the good intentions are gone. So social enterprises became more on my radar at that time, especially in a place like Cambodia. There tended to be lots of these small little, people who decided to try some of their hand into doing little small businesses, for the social good of the community, whether they were cafes or different clothing companies. But then the thing that I was noticing about the social enterprises is that it was kind of this weird bridge with good intentions, but people weren't yet set on it being a business, so it was technically a profit company, but it wasn't being operated still like a business. There was almost a bit of like, profit's a dirty word. We're here to do good. We don't want to be seen as trying to make money off of these people, which you don't. I mean, you don't want to feel like you're exploiting anybody. But a lot of these social enterprises struggle as well to be sustainable. So and we're like, okay, well, it's the right model, but there's a wrong mindset. So social enterprises became really interesting to me. After I was at my job for 5 years, I decided to quit. Was ready for a new adventure. I started my MBA, which is where and how I met Maya. Um, and at the same time, I was reintroduced to Monica, who's my current business partner. So Monica and I, she's Canadian as well, but she's been living in Cambodia for almost 20 years. Her husband is Cambodian. They have a daughter. Um, and she had a very interesting story. So she had worked in international development here in Cambodia in the early 2000s, working in the education space, and she noticed that a lot of the women here, they didn't have the same opportunity for education as the men, and so they weren't as likely to have a job. And then if they were, it was very often that they would have to be home looking after the kids as well, so they wouldn't be able to keep the job. And so she was a knitter. Knitting is a family skill. And so she thought, if I could teach some of these village women to knit and crochet, they'd be able to make some things and sell them, and then they would have some income for their family in a way that would be flexible to their own needs, right? So they could work when they wanted to, at home, and if they had a lot of time, they could make a lot of pieces and sell them, only a little time, and they could just make a few, right? So she had this idea of fair, flexible employment to accommodate the women's lifestyles and the demands that were put on them. So she didn't ever intend to be a business owner. She's a self-proclaimed reluctant business owner. She's got a socialist, background and heritage 'cause she's Polish. So the idea of business and that whole making a profit thing is definitely something that she feels, sometimes uncomfortable about. But this started as, like I said, almost 15 years ago now, as this small project of 5 women in her living room knitting toys, knitting these small crochet toys. And over the years, it grew into a fairly substantial business here in Cambodia. A lot of local tourism, tourists would come, and there's very few things that are made for kids. And so sales from tourism just soared. In 2019, before COVID, I think revenue around there was about $100,000, which in Cambodia is quite significant. And and then COVID hit, and so with COVID went the tourists, and with tourists
Mm.
went the sales, and so she was kind of in a bit of a pickle, and she wasn't quite sure what to do. And she was in a situation where she's like, "Well, do I shut this down, and do I tell all these women, I'm sorry, we don't have jobs for you anymore, or do I try to do something, and what can I do?" And so we had been acquaintances, and we had a mutual friend, and he reintroduced us. He said, "Hey, Michael's working on his MBA. He's really interested in business stuff. Maybe you guys can work together or something like that." And so when we initially met for coffee, we didn't really know what was going to be, going on, what we are going to do, and we got talking, and you know, we decided the only way for this company to survive was to take it global. There was no way to know when tourists would come back. The local Cambodian market, even though the economy here is growing and there's a growing middle class, would still not buy these products at a price point that would be sustainable for a long enough time for it to work, to wait until tourists came back, to sustain the sales. So the only way was to say, well, how do we start shipping these overseas? How do we start going to a global market? Over the years, there was already validation of the concept. People already loved the products, so we felt pretty sure as long as we can get them in the hands of people other places in the world, then this can work. So we did decide to rebrand. We actually spun out a new company, which was called BB and Bongo. The original company was called Cambodia Knits. The original company still exists. Cambodia Knits is the manufacturer of our products. That is registered and based in Cambodia. And then we spun out BB and Bongo, which was more of a global name. We thought it could appeal to more people, more customers. It was also more playful. Monica wanted to take things in a more playful route. Anybody who knows us is we like to joke around a lot. We do a dad jokes segment during the year. And we're making toys, so it should be playful and it should be fun. So BB and Bongo is the more global, playful brand. So that's registered in Singapore. Also for financial regions is again, if you don't know anything about Cambodia, in terms of the laws around money and taxes and things like that, it can get quite sticky and shady sometimes. And we knew that if we wanted a global company, then at some point we would probably need outside investment. And so registering in Singapore would just give it a bit more credibility, I think, for any outside investors that might come in. So we spun off, we started that new company, and we did a Kickstarter in late 2020. The Kickstarter was designed for two things. One, to help us launch the new brand, and then the other was to hopefully turn all of our yarn into organic yarn. So up until then, we've been using, and even now, we're still using a cotton acrylic blend for most of the stuff. But we really want to move to being more eco-friendly, being more as eco-friendly throughout the whole supply chain as possible. For tourists here in Cambodia, that may not matter as much. People are really moved by the story of just helping Cambodian women have jobs. But when you take your product global, you have a different set of considerations. You have pickier customers. You have regulations in different countries, especially if you want to be called fair trade or organic. So over the last year, we've been working towards moving to organic. We're still working on it, but we're hoping by about March this year we'll be able to move over to the full organic line, so that will be even more eco-friendly. And because yarn by itself is very waste-free, that we don't have scraps. It all gets pretty much used up. Yeah, and then as of last August, we have fulfillment now in the U.S. So we had a few wholesalers in Australia going into BB and Bongo, but the U.S. was really our main target for many reasons. We know a lot of even Japanese companies. It's kind of the golden ticket, right? If you can make it in the U.S., then it pretty much means you could probably make it anywhere. Although I'm learning that maybe Japan might be the place to prove a concept and make a business as well. So over the last year and certainly 6 months, fulfillment and retail sales in the U.S. has been a key factor for us, and now we're at a stage of looking for outside investment in order to scale and grow. When you're doing manufacturing, then making bulk purchases of raw materials and being able to do bulk shipping is what's going to keep our margins reasonable and hopefully profitable in the end. And then my last note on profitability, I guess, before we maybe open it up to questions is, and why I feel so strongly that you can do good for the world and make a profit is that profit is what makes it all possible. Like, we have a company, we're making toys, and we're having a lot of fun doing it, right? But if we're not profitable, then we can't build more, we can't create new products, or we can't create new initiatives even within our brand, right? We make a line of educational toys. It would be really exciting to me to do invest and make educational play spaces in spaces around the world for people. But you can't do things like that if you don't have profit to work with. So I think that's why it's really important that the two are linked. So, yeah, I think that's my story. I think I think that covers a lot of it.
Yes.
Wow, I could listen to you all day, Michael. I get inspired listening to what you're saying, and what really resonated with me was the idea of doing good and making a profit. Because I kind of studied the old school, both Americans and Japanese business leaders, and Omran's Kazuma Tateshi is like one of my heroes because he believed that contributing to society creates long-term sustainable conditions. And if you have a long-term orientation, then a business is like a servant to society. And if you serve society and contribute to it, it'll come back in a profitable and a sustainable way so you can continue doing it. And the example I like to give is he actually built a new company. It was Omron Tayo in Kyushu, and he staffed it entirely with severely handicapped people. And out of respect for his employees, he held them to exactly the same standards and operational goals that he did in all his other divisions. And they exceeded targets and they turned a profit just in 1 year. And in his mind, this was a proof of concept that, it helps society in the long term, but you got to shift your way of thinking to the long term rather than short term, next quarter's profits. So that's a long way of just saying it really resonated with me because I was kind of raised to believe that from the beginning. And I'm so glad you're doing what you're doing. So thank you very much. And I hope we have some really interesting people in the audience. I hope you guys will come up and join the discussion. I invited several of you just because I knew, hopefully you enjoyed Michael's story as much as I did. Maya, any thoughts or comments?
Yes, to me, well, that line which you just mentioned, and Michael's credo about you can make good for the world and you can do good for the world, make profit, resonated too, but exactly for the opposite reason, because I come from from Bulgaria, which used to be a socialist country, and probably like your partner, Monica. For me, the struggle comes from the opposite direction, something to help people succeed, but it's more like a feeling rather than a profitable business model. So I'm still learning, and it was fascinating to listen to you talk about this. So we got Frank. Good morning, Frank.
Good morning, Frank. Thank you for coming up on stage.
No, Thanks very much for inviting me to this, and it's really interesting, Michael, what you're doing. The reason I jumped in early is because I'll be in a car later on, and possibly we'll be going through some tunnels. So just wanted to jump on and say hello to Michael, and I've hooked up with you already on LinkedIn, and I'd love to talk offline. There are a few things. There's some people here in Japan that I think would be interesting for you to talk to. I also have a partner in China who's interested in this sort of thing, and also down in Australia. And that's all I'll say for the moment, and I'll jump off and let's catch up offline. And I just encourage. I see Adam Fulford's in the room as well, and you should definitely talk to Adam. He would have, if he wasn't here, he would have been one of the people I would have wanted to introduce you to.
Oh, thanks, Frank. That sounds great. I'll check you out on LinkedIn, and let's have a conversation.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Drive safe.
Thank you, Frank. Ren.
Good morning, Ren. Thank you for coming up on stage.
Good morning. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, Michael. It's a very inspiring story that you have shared with us. Thank you very much, and thank you, Maya and Timothy, always for hosting a wonderful room. Always something to learn. And the reason I jump on the stage was because of the word prophet. I just like Timothy. You mentioned you have a hero, Omron. The founder of Omron, and one of my heroes is the founder of Panasonic, which is Konosuke Matsushita. I remember he mentioned that profit is important because without a profit, you can't pay corporate tax. And by paying corporate tax, you are indeed making contributions to the society. So if you're doing, things like what Michael is doing, which is great to begin with, but in addition to that, if you're also able to make profit. It's a home run, right? You are making a contribution to the society in a double weight. And I just want to echo what Michael is doing at this point. So I came up to the stage, but I hope that's something that's useful comment for everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Ren. Actually, that's a very insightful comment. I wrote that down, and I think the reason I found that so interesting was because here in Cambodia and like many places, there's an informal economy where you have a lot of these small businesses and sometimes social enterprises who don't register. And there's a lot of animosity sometimes to the idea of registering and the idea of paying taxes as it being a bad thing. But I actually love the way you put that. It's that you're contributing to society when you pay taxes. Now, it sometimes depends on how much you believe in your government, which in a place like Cambodia can be a challenge. But I think that's if more of the informal economy looked at it that way, especially for some of the smaller social enterprises who have been resistant in some of these communities to register. I think that would change a lot of things. So thank you for that. That was very, very interesting.
Thank you, Ren. Can't wait to hear what Adam has to say. Adam, good morning. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, good morning. Very nice to hear this interesting story from Cambodia, and thanks for the invitation to this room. Well, Michael, just to give you a very quick background, I do a lot of work in regional activation in the Japanese countryside. And I have one very practical question, and then I'd like to comment a little bit about my view of engagements in village communities. My practical question is, how do you source your yarn?
Oh, this is a great question, and it's something we've been working on this year because we were looking to switch over to organic yarns. So we had a supplier lined up in China who we had worked with on some small projects before, and this was last spring, but that was about the same time the whole Uyghur cotton sort of scandal stuff was coming up, and when we talked to our supplier, they couldn't guarantee that our cotton didn't come from that sort of oppressed area. So because we couldn't have any kind of assurances, we had to pull from that supplier, which is one of the reasons why it's taken a bit longer. My business partner, she's the yarn master, but so I'm gonna echo what I know through working with her on that, is that we go through the certification as there's like the GOTS certified yarn and things like that. I think OTEX is the other certification. So there's a few manufacturers that have that sort of visibility on their supply chain that can have those international certifications. So right now we have a partner in Turkey that we're starting to work with, and one in Italy that, to the best of our knowledge, has that transparent supply chain where we can feel good saying these are ethically made products.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to clarify how that aspect of the operation was operating. So just to say a little bit about my thoughts on engagements with small communities. Having started in this area about 10 years ago, it took me about 5 years to realize that I was going in with a very arrogant mindset. And so learning humility has been a big part of the process over the past 10 years. The other aspect of this is actually regarding the culture of villages, which increasingly I'm seeing as something that is vital for people in urban environments to remain aware of and actually to access. Because I think that there are traditions of sustainability in traditional communities that we are rapidly losing sight of. And those villages themselves are disappearing very quickly, for example, in regional Japan. The allure of the bigger entities, the bigger cities, the bigger business, actually moves things that were very important for us in a community setting in the past. It moves that kind of way of thinking, those values into the background. They become less relevant. We don't see their importance any longer. But I think because of coronavirus, it's been an opportunity for a lot of people to think again about exactly how communities are structured. I think that Clubhouse itself is one instance of a new way of thinking about forming communities. But what I wanted to ask is, in your context, I know that you're building up this business based on the reality of how people live in the community that you're engaging with. But are you at the same time doing anything to activate the value that is in that community for the reference of people outside?
That's a good question. Like in what sort of way? Like having people be introduced to the environment, or?
Well, what I'm thinking of is that probably the communities I'm not clear yet, that maybe this is a question I should also clarify with you, is what kind of size of community are you talking about where the women are working at home and producing these goods?
So we have a number of different villages over the in the country. So at any given space, there might be like 8 women in a village, 15 women in a village, and typically we would have one team lead there. That's sort of, or that's probably even too aggressive of a word. One kind of main contact who facilitates the distribution of the raw materials, the collection of the goods when they're done. We do trainings as well. So if we're doing, certainly when we're training up new people, if we have new products, or if they need a refresher, like if we're noticing that quality is coming in and it's less than what we're used to seeing from a particular group, which is not very often. And then the deployment model is still one that's fair and flexible, and I think this is something that we are now, because we are trying to scale, becomes a challenge in terms of that's a really important value of our company, is to maintain that fair and flexible employment where women are able to work as much or as little as they want. The challenge then for us is then production capacity is that becomes sort of flexible in a gray area in terms of projections, right? So because we have to know, like, are people going to be available to work? And so that's something that it's a new challenge for us going into the year, is that how do we maintain that aspect so that they can live their lives as they need to. They can take their kids to school, they can pick them up, they can do whatever they need to do and still do this as well. So, yeah.
Just so that I know, and I think maybe a lot of other people in the audience would also like to have a greater familiarity with the kind of social dynamics in Cambodia these days. People in the villages, do they aspire actually to go and live in a place like Phnom Penh or at least a bigger community, or are they generally very settled in the villages and don't plan to leave?
Oh, that's a great question. Both. So the way that the communities tend to work here is most people, I mean, 80% of the population is still rural. Only about, I guess there's about 2 million people in Phnom Penh, and then maybe there can't be even 1 million, I don't think, in Siem Reap. So most of the population, there's about 16 million people in Cambodia. So most of the population is still rural. What tends to happen is somebody in the family goes to work at in a city or in a bigger town nearby or a factory. Most people here will have they have their countryside family. Their family probably owns some property in the village, and that's what they'll go back to. Like at holidays, the city's just empty and everybody goes to the countryside. So there's still a very vibrant culture in the countryside here. And even when you meet people in the city, it's typical to ask, like, "Oh, where's your family from?" Because that's kind of their home place. It's very unlikely that they're from the city. Sometimes they are, but for families that at this stage, it's like they aspire to they're in sort of that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They're still they're not in the place of like, oh, I want to do what I love. They're in the, I want somebody in our family wants to have a sustainable job. They want to have education. They want to, a government job is perfect, that type of thing, or a factory job where they know it's going to be a reliable income. So yeah, there's a bit of that.
Yeah, and I see that, well, I think most of the people in the room today have strong associations with Japan. And a question I'd like to ask in that context is, do you know anybody in the communities you work with who might be working as a trainee or a student or something like that in Japan?
No, most of our workers are actually older women, to be honest. I think we'll have an opportunity for we have some younger women, and certainly in the head office in Phnom Penh. And I think in terms of where we can grow our work, like the production capacity, will be in probably young mums. But it's been a lot of the older women who are over the age of 50 or 40 here, because that's old when you're already a grandmother at 40. Your family is not really expecting you to be participating in the economy. But for some of these older women, their families have left. They're in the city, and they can't always just wait on remittances. So we do have a decent amount of people over the age of 50.
Yeah, sorry, to clarify, I wasn't really thinking about the people who are actually working with you, but just in the community at large. Are you aware of any movement to get employment in Japan among the young men, for example, or the young women in the community?
That's a good question. I mean, not off the top of my head can I think of people, but I do know that in terms of a country that people admire, or if they had an opportunity to go to. I had a colleague that I worked with before who did some university in Japan. So, I mean, Japan is thought of as a good place to go versus people don't have the same affinity to, say, Vietnam. But
Yeah, actually, Vietnam is very much, it's becoming increasingly something that people focus on in Japan, because there are probably about 400,000 Vietnamese now working in Japan, whereas 10 years ago there were very few. And as the regulations change in Japan, I think there's going to be a greater movement of people from Southeast Asia into the economy in Japan. And what I'm thinking of from my perspective is how that might link back to what you're doing, because I'm coming into greater contact all the time with Vietnamese working in places like Fukushima. And we're trying to make these links back to Southeast Asia. So what you're speaking about is, for me, a very useful way of thinking about possible future paths. And I don't want to take up more of your time with my own questions, but thank you very much for your input today.
Thanks, Adam. No, that's actually a great seed to plant. Yeah, let me think on that. I'm going to reflect on that because I think you're right. From what I've learned about Japanese culture and economy, having done the studies there, was there's the declining population, and everybody's people have to come from somewhere. And I would think that if Cambodians had the opportunity, they absolutely would go to Japan.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you, Adam, for those great comments. I always appreciate your point of view, and I kind of to playing off of Adam's point, Michael, what like having worked with these are small communities, and having worked with them, what sort of, how would I put it, what values and dynamics within their villages have you come to admire and feel like maybe those of us who are now city dwellers have lost touch with, or it's maybe something we could learn from that community? And I'm gonna go out on a limb and say, would you characterize Cambodia as a collectivist culture? It would seem to me it would be, but I'm just curious.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, even before working with Monica on this project, when I was at the Social Innovation Lab, 17 Triggers, we did a lot of work in villages. So I spent a lot of time traveling to different places in the country. Is it a collective? That's interesting. It's a very family-oriented culture. Like, if you are family, then you're sort of, it's a very tight-knit group, and if you're not family, it's not that you're not welcome, but it's you're just very distinctly not family. But within the community space, it's maybe collective would be the way to put it. I mean, there's always, like, for example, kids running around, naked little kids, and somebody down the road is keeping watch on them, There's not, like, so in terms of, like, taking care of things, like, especially the women, you see them all usually together, very, a social environment, and certainly compared to the city, you don't see that. So that's something that this Cambodia still has, that sort of togetherness. So yeah, now that I'm thinking about it, it's very social. Cambodians are very social. They're not loners. You don't see you see a lot of little groups of people, even in the cities, in places where there's open spaces. the families will come and have like picnics in the evenings and just sit, or they'll play games outside. So even though there's a very high mobile phone culture here and people are on their phones a lot, they're also outside a lot. So like outside leisurely, I mean. And in villages, yeah, you just see that small town. The best way I can think of it is like small town. Like people are just walking over to others' houses. I was in one project a number of years ago. We were doing a nutrition project, and I was doing a sort of day in the life of spending the day with his family. And they, talk me through like how do you make your soup? Like what do you make? And like, oh, sometimes my neighbor will come over and and she'll ask for a banana leaf or whatever, and then I'll give her this, and she'll come back later and bring me some soup and stuff. And no word of a lie, like we just had this conversation, and not 30 minutes later, her neighbor comes over, and and says, hey, do you have whatever it was? And she sits and chats with the neighbor for a little while. So that type of almost like barter system is still pretty strong here.
That's
Especially in the rural
interesting.
areas.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
yeah.
Yeah, and the reason I mentioned it, one of the things that struck me early on when I first came to Japan, and this was, 1977, so I'm aging myself. I come from this country where, we cooperate, but we also, sometimes we don't cooperate, right? And I noticed getting in good with a Japanese group of friends, if they would have some little project to do, like, I don't know, putting up Christmas decorations, there were like 6 or 7 of them, and like without any words being spoken, they just naturally knew how to cooperate, and they would coordinate, and in no time the beautiful decorations would be up.
Yeah.
And I always thought it was funny because I could see my family going, no, put that over there, no, you should, we'd be arguing about where to put the star on the tree, but they were just so in sync with each other, and there was this, I don't know. Well, harmony obviously is one of the supreme values here, and so cooperation kind of comes natural. So that was something that struck me as much different than from where I had come from. And so I was just trying to give you an example. And the way it sounds like, Cambodia is very familial, and they seem to be, as you said, a tight knit community, which Japan too has similarities. You're an insider or outsider, right? So it's hard to get in, but once you're in, that you become almost like family. So that's where my point of view is coming from.
Yeah, no, it's actually been interesting studying through a Japanese university because when I grew up in Canada, and my idea of Japan was like, technology, because I was like a kid of the 80s, right? So that was when Japan was in its technology boom. So it's like, there's still that in my head that's what, Japan is. And then, of course, now studying for the last almost 2 years now, there's actually a lot of similarities between Japan and Cambodia. Certainly, like from a cultural approach to things, or even like the way that different corporate culture is described. It's very, very similar. So I don't know if it's exactly the same throughout Asia, but I was definitely seeing a thread of commonality in that. That organization, like you said, of like, they just sort of are all in harmony, almost like little worker bees. Certainly when, I don't know if I see it as much with women, maybe, because when I see projects like that, but even if I'm doing something out in, like, even going to grocery stores, like there'll be the tuk-tuk driver, there'll be the guy who brings up the groceries, and they'll just do it together. Like they won't talk about it. They'll just like, oh, we're doing it this way. And then I just had construction out in front of my street, and it was the same sort of thing. Like people are just sort of, yeah, they just, compared to like what you said before, like, oh, somebody saying, oh, do this, like you're talking about it, but you're not. That's not the same as just actively working together to do it. So I would agree that there's a similarity to that here for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at throughout Asia, most of these countries are rice culture, so you have that commonality.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about Cambodia, but a lot of Confucianism has spread throughout, and Buddhism as well. And a lot of them have shamanistic roots because many of these, were agricultural communities, which that tends to go hand in hand with rice culture. So it doesn't surprise me that there are similarities.
Mm-hmm.
If I could just jump in there, it's Adam here again. Yeah, I would have made exactly the same points that Tim just made, that I think that when you grow rice together, that tends to have a social impact. You tend to grow communities around the values that are associated with getting together to plant and harvest rice together. And this huge Chinese influence historically, which has spread in different directions and influenced Japan, probably in slightly different ways from the way that it influences other parts of Southeast Asia, although I know nothing about that, really. I'm just guessing. But I think that that's one of the interesting aspects of living in Japan, as I know Tim's been here a long time, I've been here 40 years, is seeing the way in which the traditional community value set has been grown into cities. in Japan, that many people in Japan still have this basic understanding of operating as members of a community, which you see very clearly in some companies. And it's clearly different from the kind of community that you would experience in a company in North America or in Europe, I think. And I'm very interested in bridging those differences to find out what the advantages on both sides are, in fact.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off that point, Adam, I think we'll all agree that these, the community emphasis in Japan, and I guess I would call it the collectivist mentality, I think has contributed strongly to Japan's overall really positive response to COVID. Because they couldn't do lockdowns, but they didn't have to. The strength of the culture, put aside politics and politicians, the strength of the culture really helped. I mean, Japan still has, I think, under 19,000 deaths total from COVID. I thought it was going to be a disaster, and to me, I'm surprised. But you know what? I'm happy I'm living here because you don't have to make people do stuff. People wear their masks. They are concerned about the people around them. They're very clean, hygienic people. They're not loud talkers. In fact, Maya and I were talking about this, saying, nobody talks on the train. It's just quiet, and they're not huggers and they're not kissers, and all these different cultural factors, I think, prove to be a big strength for Japan. Some people might have a different point of view, but that's kind of how I see it as well. So those values directly impacted, I think, the overall societal response to the pandemic.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, it was similar. Like, it was interesting that it was the culture that sort of led to that sort of, I would say, obedience to what to do at this time. Whereas in Cambodia, high levels of also obedience, but for completely different reasons. I mean, maybe the community. No, I don't think the community culture would have been strong enough. I mean, it's definitely from a government dictator. Like, the government says you're going to get vaccinated, you're going to get vaccinated. The government says you're going to wear a mask, you're going to wear a mask. So, in that way, it's also very different than the West, for example. They don't even question it. It's like, this is what I'm told to do. And then certainly with Cambodia, because of the Khmer Rouge, which is still not that long ago, only 40 years, and certainly civil war and stuff like that still up until the 90s. So for a lot of people, obedience to authority is still a thing here.
A lot of people here, foreign people, I mean non-Japanese people in the room, have lived in Japan for quite a while, and what we have noticed, there is a pattern actually. So as Tim said the other day, we come here kicking and screaming. We think that we can bring and impose our cultural values onto the local communities because we believe that our cultural values are much better than theirs, which is really a funny way to approach any culture. It's not just the Japanese culture or any other culture, but and so as Adam said, on the way, in the process, we become humble and begin to understand that what we believe in is not really how things work here. And so there are some sustainable ways, practices which are ingrained in the local communities' mindsets, and they have been here for centuries and centuries. And we are, with our modern ways of thinking, we just overlook them and lose sight of them sometimes, and just push forward in a kind of not so mindful way. And so, that's one of the reasons why, actually, when I saw, the BB and Bongo and what you're doing in Cambodia, I thought, wow, this is great because you're trying to adjust your model to the local communities. And I have wondered whether this has been a challenge for you or not. Because just a couple of minutes ago, you said that you're thinking, of how to supply the yarn to the different communities and how to have the women there work so that they can still go around their daily chores without much disturbance. And this is really interesting to me to hear from you. So was it really a challenge? And how, if it was, how did you went about it? Because it's logistics, and logistics is very important for every business to be sustainable and doing well.
Mm-hmm. It's historically, it hasn't been as much of a challenge because sometimes women wanted to work more than we had work for them to do.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a challenge that I've been foreseeing for at least the last 6 months when you're hoping to now do bigger bulk orders. And one of the ways that we're talking about overcoming this is to create a tiered system of employment types, where there can be these. So, for example, a quarter-time worker, where they would be sort of committing to X number of hours or X number of items per month or per week or even per day, like whatever. Like sometimes it's easier for them to just think about per day than it is even from a weekly or monthly. And then so quarter time, half time, and full time, because there are some people who just if we who would want to do it full time, right? Like this is I
Yes.
can do this, and I want more. Just give me more and more work to do, right? So I think in having some type of either tiered employment system or a mix of like having a tiered employment while still having the current model, which is sort of whenever, however. The problem I have with the whenever, however, is that it makes it really, really hard to scale, right? So without
Yeah.
some sort of way to incorporate that flexibility, and the thing is that here, like, it's interesting because like we as Westerners, I think, value that sort of flexibility a lot more than some of the people here do, because most of the people here are still driven by their finances, right? So
Yeah.
if they can make more money, they want to make more money. But we also want to be aware of like these are, they have they exist in a culture that still demands a lot of them. Whether they want to make more money or do more, right? And it can also be overwhelming. Your eyes can be bigger than your stomach, right? Like you can try to do everything, but then that's not useful to anything, right? So I think it's going to be probably an ongoing challenge to maintain the values of that sort of system, and sort of that respect for the culture that exists, and we're not trying to make it something new. But it also may mean having, say, for example, like we have a head office in Phnom Penh, and we have, I think, five full-time knitters there, and that's kind of our like core staff. And then we have, I think 6 or 8 villages. But we may then open another sort of head office in Siem Reap, where I'm based, where we would then have a few full-time knitters, right? So then that would sort of give us more lens on what the production capacity can be, while giving the people who are in the village who want to be there and who just want that flexibility, and at the same time offering better jobs for people who want those jobs, where if they're in-house, they don't just have to be knitters, right? The opportunity to do admin skills, like we have a few young girls in the Phnom Penh office, right? One who's sort of training right now to be an accountant. She's our bookkeeper, and she's working with our finance manager. And another person we're sort of training up for production management. So there's room as we grow for their skill sets to grow, and to offer different kinds of jobs as well. So so I guess the short answer though is it's an ongoing challenge, but I think a good one.
Yes, it is a good one, and I love the what you're doing about upskilling, or let's say the skill training of the employees there. So it's a fascinating project, I believe, and challenging, of course. But
Yeah, Michael, whenever you say manufacturing, my ears perk up because I did that for a long part of my career, including industrial engineering and factory. I managed a factory. And so I have a very specific question related to that, because part of my job was making jobs really easy for people, like minimizing their movements, and making everything natural and rhythmical, and avoiding stress on the neck and things like carpal tunnel syndrome, avoiding that. Um, is there any thought put into that, or do you see any issues with the people who are doing all this knitting? Or maybe they're a culture that just doesn't complain. I don't know. Just curious.
No, this is actually a really good question, and it's something that it's a bit of a gray area. So right now we're in the process of doing our application for World Fair Trade certification. It's a very lengthy application and a bit expensive, but we got a grant earlier in the year for that. Now, one of the challenges as we were going through the application, though, is that it's essentially designed for a factory situation, right? Where you have a lens on all your workers, you're supervising them, you can see what their working conditions are like, and and you can monitor that. You can make sure that they're not working more than 8 hours a day. You can make sure that their 12-year-old daughter isn't deciding to help out because she's interested in helping out, right? So we're running into a bit of like a roadblock in terms of what's the best way to navigate this, because we don't have a factory. We're not set up as a factory, and we're not supervising the 8 women in Kampong Cham province who are making our monkey finger puppets. We don't know if they're deciding to work 8 hours a day or more, or like I said, if their 12-year-old son, daughter is interested in helping, or we don't have a lens on that. And as soon as we move into a more organized system, then it's at a cost, right? What's the trade-off, right? Right now, the trade-off is maintain the village sort of situation, for not having clear sight and just sort of taking the word from the people that they're happy, and we're not getting any complaints about anything, and we're still seeing good quality. or it's having that full transparency over our own supply chain and being able to say without any reservation, these women are being cared for in the best way possible. We make sure they do this. They have these things. They have the. I mean, they already get benefits, but like the government coverage and things like that. But so, I mean, actually, Tim, I'd be really interested to have a separate conversation with you around this, because I think this will be a challenge for us as we scale in how do you maintain that balance of transparency and, making things good for the workers, maintain the quality and achieve everything you need, while not maybe sacrificing, or if we have to sacrifice elements of sort of that village life, then what does that look like, and how can that be done in a way that's sort of good for everyone?
Yeah, I look at it as an opportunity. To me, it's an exciting new model, and I think there is a value with not having a factory, maybe. And I'm not saying maybe at some point you would have a gathering place where they could come together, but maybe you could turn it almost into a social, a quasi workplace social thing, for lack of a better term. But right now, just listening to you, and I have to think about it more now, but the direction my mind goes into is training people to make their own job easier, and finding people who work for you already, who maybe have better methods than other people, because they've set themselves up in a way that maybe their neck isn't strained because they're looking down all the time, and maybe it improves their productivity because they've made their own jobs easier. And I used to train factory people on how to think like an industrial engineer, with just really simple concepts, and then let them propose things. And then once they do it and show other people, they can actually train their friends and people around them to make their life easier. And that might be a direction maybe to consider. And I know that, I'm not saying that's the answer, but those are the kind of ideas that percolate in my head when I listen to what you're saying.
Yeah, like I said, I'd love to have a separate chat with you around that area specifically. Yeah, I think that would be good.
Sure, let's do that.
Yes, and I think that Ren also can be helpful in this sense of the word. I'm not sure, of course, but because Ren has set up his company and he has scaled it really well, so there are quite a few things to learn there too, if Ren is willing to share, of course, that know-how.
Yeah, Maya, you have always been talking so great about me. Thank you so much. But I'm not sure scaling is the right word, because we are still a small company. But yes, we are always thinking about how to reach other markets around the world, even though we are in a different industry. And Michael, I'm going to LinkedIn with you, and then maybe we can talk offline if there's some similarities or commonalities. We can share our thoughts. That'll be great. But I am in a tech firm. I'm running a technology company, and it is a challenge how to manage teams around the world. And it all comes down to culture. Different people have different ways of doing things, and I guess for people like us, we just have to make sure we get the best out of everyone, instead of conflict, right?
Yes.
So
Collaborate, not that's not compete, right? So
yeah, compete is good things.
it is a good thing, yes. But
Yeah,
if we just compete without any collaboration,
right. I would say compete with positive energy, right?
oh, that's a very good way to put it. Yes. So, Siren, that's why I have always good things to say about you.
Okay, thank you.
Michael, if you have anything to say in conclusion before we close the room, please go ahead and do it.
Just to thank everyone for their thoughtful questions and insights. I've been taking notes as we've gone along, so yeah, very excited to connect with a few of you. I think this would be great. I think connections is what is needed. Everybody, can help each other, and that friendly competition is nice. So I think the collaboration is better. So I'm also happy to, if I can connect anybody with anyone, or there's ways that we can work together to have win-win situations. I'm all for that.
Yeah, thank you so very much to everybody. Well, Adam and Frank and Ren for coming up and joining this discussion. I wish you a great day. Well, that's it for today. Thanks. And
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Have
Have a great day. Bye now.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air next week on Thursday at 8 a.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we're looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make the best of the day. See you.